Judge Angela Williams had been on the bench for 12 years, and she thought she had seen everything. Tuesday mornings in criminal court were usually routine, a steady stream of cases that blended together after so many years of service. She adjusted her reading glasses and looked down at the docket, scanning through the list of defendants scheduled to appear before her that day. The courtroom was filling up slowly. Lawyers shuffled papers, family members whispered nervously in the gallery, and court officers moved with practiced efficiency. Angela had developed a rhythm over the years, a way of maintaining both authority and compassion from behind the bench. She believed deeply in fairness and giving every person who appeared before her the dignity they deserved, regardless of what brought them there. "All rise," called the bailiff, and the familiar sounds of a courtroom coming to order filled the air. Angela took her seat and opened the first file. The morning proceeded as expected. A few plea deals, some sentencing hearings, nothing out of the ordinary. She handled each case with the same careful attention she always brought to her work. It was nearly 11 o'clock when the bailiff called out, "The State versus David Coleman." Angela looked up from her papers as the side door opened, and a man in an orange jumpsuit was escorted to the defendant's table. The moment she saw his face, everything in her world stopped. 23 years. That's how long it had been since she'd last seen David Coleman. But time hadn't erased the memory of those dark eyes, the way his left eyebrow had a small scar from a childhood accident, or how he used to bite his lower lip when he was thinking hard about something. He was doing it right now, and Angela felt her heart hammering against her ribs. David looked older, of course. His face was thinner, lines etched around his eyes that spoke of hard living and difficult choices. His hair was shorter now, with gray creeping in at the temples. But it was undeniably him, the same man who had walked across the stage at their college graduation, who had held her hand during late-night study sessions, who had promised her forever in a dorm room that smelled like instant coffee and dreams. Angela's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the bench. She forced herself to breathe normally, to maintain the composed expression that had become second nature after so many years as a judge. But inside, memories were flooding back with overwhelming force. She remembered their first meeting in Professor Jackson's constitutional law class. David had been the student who always asked the hard questions, who stayed after class to debate legal theory. He was passionate about justice, about using the law to help people who couldn't help themselves. Angela had been drawn to that passion, to the way his eyes lit up when he talked about making a difference in the world. They had been inseparable for 3 years. Study partners who became best friends who became lovers. They spent countless hours in the law library, quizzing each other for exams and planning their future together. David wanted to be a public defender, to represent people who couldn't afford expensive lawyers. Angela dreamed of becoming a prosecutor, fighting for victims' rights. They used to joke that they'd face each other in court someday, but it would make them both better lawyers. The summer after their second year, David had proposed. It wasn't anything fancy, just the two of them sitting on the steps of the courthouse where they had both interned, sharing Chinese takeout and talking about their dreams. He didn't have a ring, but he promised he'd buy her one as soon as he could afford it. Angela had said yes without hesitation, certain that they would build a life together devoted to justice and service. But life had other plans. During their final year of law school, David's younger brother was killed in a car accident caused by a drunk driver. The tragedy hit David hard, sending him into a spiral of grief and anger that changed everything between them. He started drinking more, staying out late, picking fights over small things. Angela tried to be supportive, but David pulled away from everyone, including her. The breaking point came during bar exam preparations. David had been drinking heavily the night before a crucial study session and showed up late, disheveled and argumentative. When Angela tried to talk to him about getting help, he exploded, accusing her of not understanding his pain and caring more about her career than their relationship. The fight was ugly and final. David stormed out, and Angela never saw him again. She heard through mutual friends that he had barely passed the bar exam and taken a job at a small firm across the state. Later, she learned he had been let go from that job and then another. The last she had heard, years ago, was that he was struggling with addiction and had lost his law license. After that, the updates stopped coming, and David Coleman became just a painful memory from her past. Now here he was, standing in her courtroom in handcuffs, looking nothing like the brilliant law student she had once loved. The irony was almost too much to bear. She had achieved everything they had once planned together. She was exactly where she had always dreamed of being, dispensing justice from behind the bench. But David, who had been just as passionate about the law as she was, had ended up on the other side of it. Angela glanced down at the file in front of her. Armed robbery. The charges were serious, carrying a potential sentence of 15 to 25 years. Her stomach clenched as she read the details. A convenience store on the south side of town, security footage, witness testimony. If convicted, David would likely spend the rest of his productive years in prison. The prosecutor was already standing, ready to begin presenting the case. David's public defender, a young woman who looked overwhelmed and underprepared, was shuffling through a stack of papers with obvious nervousness. Angela realized she was faced with an impossible situation. Every instinct told her she should recuse herself immediately. The ethical rules were clear. Judges must step aside when they have a personal relationship with someone involved in a case. It was the right thing to do, the professional thing to do, but something in David's eyes, a mixture of resignation and barely concealed desperation, made her hesitate. She knew that if she recused herself, the case would go to Judge Morrison, who was known for his harsh sentences and impatience with repeat offenders. Or it might go to Judge Peters, who was counting down the days to retirement and had little interest in anything that might complicate his schedule. Either way, David would likely receive less careful consideration than she would give him. Angela called for a brief recess, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her mind. As the courtroom emptied, she sat alone behind the bench, staring at the file that would determine the fate of a man she had once planned to marry. The weight of the moment settled on her shoulders like a heavy coat, and she knew that whatever decision she made would change everything. Angela sat alone in her chambers, the door closed firmly behind her. The familiar space that usually brought her comfort now felt suffocating. Law books lined the walls, certificates and awards hung in neat rows, and family photos smiled down at her from the credenza. Everything in this room represented the life she had built, the career she had worked so hard to achieve. And now, in one moment, it all felt fragile. She opened David's file again, reading through the details with the careful attention she brought to every case. But this time, each word felt personal. The incident had occurred 3 weeks ago at a corner market on Lincoln Street. According to the police report, a man had entered the store around 9:30 at night, demanded money from the register, and fled with approximately $300 in cash. The store's security camera had captured the entire event. The footage showed a person in a dark hoodie approaching the counter, but the image quality was grainy, and the suspect kept his head down throughout the encounter. The store clerk, a young man named Peter Kim, had identified David from a photo lineup 2 days after the robbery. A witness in the parking lot claimed to have seen David running from the store around the time of the incident. Angela studied the arrest report. Police had found David 6 blocks away from the store, walking along the street in what officers described as an agitated state. He had been carrying a small amount of cash, but no weapon. When questioned, David had been confused and unable to provide a clear explanation of where he had been that evening. A blood test revealed alcohol and traces of prescription medication in his system. The more Angela read, the more troubled she became. Not because the evidence was overwhelming, but because it seemed almost too convenient. David's public defender had filed only basic motions and hadn't requested any additional investigation. There was no mention of reviewing the security footage with enhanced technology, no attempt to interview other potential witnesses, no examination of David's whereabouts earlier that evening. Angela knew from her years on the bench that rushed cases like this often missed crucial details. Overworked public defenders, eager to move through their heavy caseloads, sometimes encourage defendants to accept plea deals without fully exploring their options. The system wasn't designed to be thorough. It was designed to be efficient. But efficiency wasn't always justice. She thought about the David she had known in law school. Even when he was struggling with grief and anger, he had never been violent.
He was the type of person who would give his last dollar to SC.
Someone in need, who once spent an entire weekend helping an elderly neighbor fix her porch instead of studying for finals. Could 23 years of hard living have changed him so completely that he would threaten an innocent store clerk for a few $100s? The knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Her clerk, Jennifer, peered around the edge of the door with a concerned expression. "Judge Williams?" "They're ready to resume in the courtroom whenever you are." Angela nodded. "Give me 5 more minutes." As the door closed again, Angela faced the decision she had been avoiding. The ethical thing to do was clear. She should call Judge Morrison's office, explain the situation, and request that the case be transferred immediately. It would be awkward, certainly, and it would raise questions about how she had failed to notice the defendant's name earlier, but it would be the right thing to do. Instead, Angela found herself thinking about all the cases she had seen over the years where defendants hadn't received adequate representation. The young mothers who pleaded guilty to drug charges because they couldn't afford to miss work for a trial. The elderly men who accepted plea deals because they were confused by the legal process and afraid to ask questions. The pattern was always the same. People who were already struggling. People who didn't have the resources to fight back. Getting swept through a system that valued speed over accuracy. David deserved better than that. Not because she had once loved him, but because everyone deserved better than that. Angela made her decision, knowing it was controversial and potentially dangerous for her career. She would not recuse herself, but she would be more careful and thorough than she had ever been before. She would make sure this case received the attention it deserved. When court resumed, Angela noticed that David's lawyer looked even more flustered than before. Lisa Chen was fresh out of law school, working for the public defender's office for less than a year. Angela had seen her in court several times, and while she was clearly intelligent and dedicated, she was also obviously overwhelmed by her caseload. The prosecutor, Robert Hayes, was a different story. He had been trying cases for 15 years and had a reputation for being thorough and aggressive. Angela knew he would present a strong case, but she also knew he would stick to the basic facts without exploring alternative theories or inconsistencies in the evidence. As Hayes began his opening statement, Angela watched David's face carefully. He seemed disconnected from the proceedings, staring down at his hands most of the time. When he did look up, there was no anger or defiance in his expression, just a deep sadness that reminded Angela of how he had looked during those final months of law school. Hayes laid out the prosecution's case with confidence. The security footage, the witness identification, David's presence in the area, his inability to explain his whereabouts. It all painted a picture of guilt that would be compelling to a jury. But Angela noticed several things that troubled her. The timing of the witness's identification was suspicious. Peter Kim had initially told police he couldn't get a good look at the robber's face, but 2 days later he picked David out of a lineup with complete certainty. The security footage, while it clearly showed a robbery taking place, was far from definitive when it came to identifying the perpetrator. The person in the video was wearing a dark hoodie and kept his face turned away from the camera throughout the incident. The height and build could match David, but they could also match thousands of other men in the city. Most troubling was the lack of physical evidence. No fingerprints were found in the store that matched David. The money he was carrying when arrested was far less than what had been stolen, and none of the bills could be traced to the store's register. No weapon was found, despite the store clerk's claim that the robber had threatened him. When it was Lisa Chen's turn to present her case, Angela's heart sank. The young lawyer's opening statement was brief and unconvincing. She mentioned David's struggles with addiction and mental health issues, suggesting that his confusion on the night of the arrest was due to his condition rather than guilt. But she offered no alternative. Theories about who might have committed the robbery or why the evidence against David was insufficient for conviction. Angela realized that if this case proceeded as it was currently structured, David would almost certainly be convicted. A jury would see the security footage, hear the witness testimony, and learn about David's presence near the scene. Without a strong defense to counter these facts, they would have little choice but to find him guilty. But Angela also knew that her position gave her unique power to ensure fairness. As the judge, she could grant additional time for investigation, require more thorough examination of evidence, and make sure that David's constitutional rights were fully protected. She could do these things for any defendant, but her personal knowledge of David's character gave her insights that might help her ask the right questions. The morning session ended with Hayes finishing his opening statement and calling his first witness. As the courtroom emptied for lunch recess, Angela remained at the bench, watching as David was led away by the bailiff. For just a moment, their eyes met across the courtroom. There was no recognition in his gaze, no indication that he remembered her, but Angela saw something there that strengthened her resolve, a spark of the intelligence and dignity that had first drawn her to him all those years ago. She knew that what she was about to do would be scrutinized by everyone involved in the case. Her colleagues, the media, and legal ethics boards would all have opinions about her decision to stay on the case. But Angela had built her career on the principle that justice required more than just following procedures. It required courage, attention to detail, and a willingness to dig deeper when something didn't feel right. As she gathered her files and prepared to leave for lunch, Angela silently promised that David Coleman would receive the fair trial that every defendant deserved, regardless of their past or their circumstances. She just hoped that her personal feelings wouldn't cloud her judgment when it mattered most. That evening, Angela sat in her home office long after her usual bedtime. David's case file spread across her desk like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't solve. Her coffee had grown cold hours ago, but she barely noticed. The quiet house around her felt different tonight, as if the past had somehow slipped through the walls and settled into every corner. She had spent the afternoon researching David's background, using the resources available to her as a judge to piece together what had happened to him in the 23 years since law school. What she found painted a picture of a life that had slowly unraveled, thread by thread, until almost nothing remained of the man she had once known. After graduation, David had indeed worked at a small law firm in Springfield, about 3 hours away. Court records showed he had handled mostly minor criminal cases and personal injury claims. His work appeared competent in those early years, though nothing suggested the brilliance she remembered from their student days. Then, about 4 years after graduation, the records became spotty. There was a disciplinary hearing with the State Bar Association, apparently related to missed court dates and failure to communicate with clients. David had received a formal reprimand but was allowed to continue practicing. 2 years later, another hearing resulted in a 6-month suspension. The final entry in his professional record was from 8 years ago: permanent revocation of his law, license due to conduct prejudicial to the administration of justice, and failure to maintain professional competence. The criminal records were even more heartbreaking. David's first arrest had come 6 years after graduation, driving under the influence. Then another DUI 2 years later, a charge for possession of controlled substances, disturbing the peace, petty theft. Each arrest seemed to build on the last, creating a pattern of someone whose life was spiraling further and further out of control. Angela found herself remembering specific moments from their time together, trying to reconcile them with the man David had become. She thought about the night they had stayed up until dawn preparing for their criminal procedure final, sharing a bag of stale donuts and debating the finer points of search and seizure law. David had been so passionate about protecting defendants' rights, so angry about the ways the system could be manipulated to hurt innocent people. The law is only as good as the people who enforce it, he had said that night, his eyes bright with conviction. That's why we have to be better. We have to care more than they expect us to. Now that same man was sitting in a jail cell accused of robbing a convenience store for a few $100s. The irony was almost too painful to contemplate. Angela turned her attention to the evidence in the current case, determined to approach it with the same methodical care she brought to every trial. But as she examined each piece, she found herself growing more troubled rather than more certain. The security footage was the prosecution's strongest evidence, but Angela had seen enough cases to know that video could be misleading. The timestamp showed the robbery occurred at 9:32 p.m., but there was no way to verify that the camera's internal clock was accurate. The figure in the video was wearing a common style of dark hoodie, the kind sold at dozens of stores throughout the city. The person's movement seemed deliberate and planned, not the confused actions of someone under the influence of alcohol and medication. The witness testimony was even more problematic. Peter Kim, the store clerk, had initially told police that the robber kept his head down and spoke in a low voice throughout the incident. He said he couldn't see the man's face clearly and wouldn't be able to identify him. But 2 days later, when shown a photo lineup, he had confidently picked out David's picture, claiming he was absolutely certain it was the same person. Angela knew from her years in court that eyewitness identification was notoriously unreliable, especially in high-stress situations like robberies. Studies had shown that witnesses often became more confident in their identifications over time, even when that confidence wasn't justified by what they had actually seen. The fact that Kim's certainty had increased rather than decreased over the 2-day period was a red flag that any experienced defense attorney should have noticed. The physical evidence was equally weak. David had been found with $47 in cash when he was arrested, far less than the $300 reportedly stolen from the store. His fingerprints weren't found anywhere in the store, and no DNA evidence linked him to the scene. The police had never recovered the alleged weapon, despite David's claim that he had never owned or carried a gun. Most puzzling was David's behavior on the night of the arrest. According to the police report, he had been walking slowly along Lincoln Street, making no attempt to flee or hide when officers approached him. When they asked for identification, he had cooperated fully, even though he seemed confused about where he was and what he had been doing. This didn't match the behavior of someone who had just committed an armed robbery and was trying to escape. Angela found herself wondering about David's mental state that night. The blood test had shown not just alcohol but also traces of prescription medication, specifically an anti-anxiety drug and an antidepressant. She had seen enough cases involving mental health issues to know that the combination of alcohol and prescription medication could cause severe confusion, memory loss, and disorientation. As she read through the psychiatric evaluation that had been conducted after David's arrest, Angela's heart ached. The report described a man suffering from severe depression, anxiety, and what appeared to be early signs of alcohol-related brain damage. David had told the evaluator that he often had trouble remembering events from recent days, especially when he had been drinking. He frequently found himself in places with no clear memory of how he had gotten there. The evaluation also revealed details about David's current living situation that made Angela's chest tighten with sadness. He had been staying at a homeless shelter for the past 3 months, having lost his apartment when he couldn't keep up with rent payments. He survived on disability benefits and occasional odd jobs, spending most of his days at the public library or walking the streets because he had nowhere else to go. Angela tried to imagine the David she had known. Brilliant, ambitious, full of plans for changing the world, reduced to such circumstances. She wondered if he ever thought about their time together, if he remembered the dreams they had shared, if he had any regrets about how his life had turned out. But personal sympathy couldn't influence her legal judgment. Angela forced herself to focus on the facts of the case, trying to see them as she would if David were a stranger. Even viewed objectively, the evidence seemed thin. The prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and a questionable eyewitness identification. Any competent defense attorney should be able to raise reasonable doubt about David's guilt. The problem was that David's attorney wasn't providing a competent defense. Lisa Chen was clearly overwhelmed and underprepared. During the day's proceedings, Angela had noticed several missed opportunities to object to questionable evidence or challenge the prosecution's assumptions. Chen seemed to be going through the motions rather than fighting for her client. Angela knew she could address some of these issues from the bench without appearing biased. She could require more thorough examination of the security footage, demand that the prosecution provide better documentation of the timeline, and ensure that David's mental health issues were properly considered during sentencing if he was convicted. These were all things she would do for any defendant, but her personal knowledge of David's character made her more motivated to be thorough. As the clock approached midnight, Angela finally closed the case file and rubbed her tired eyes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions. She would have to find a way to balance her duty as a judge with her feelings as someone who had once cared deeply for the defendant. She would have to ensure that justice was served while protecting herself from accusations of bias or impropriety. Most importantly, she would have to live with whatever decision she made, knowing that it would affect not just David's future, but also her own integrity as a judge and as a person. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any case she had ever handled, because this time, it was deeply personal. Angela turned off the lights in her office and headed upstairs to bed, knowing that sleep would be elusive. In her dreams, she would probably see David as he used to be, young, hopeful, full of fire for justice. But in the morning, she would face him as he was now, broken, confused, and counting on her to ensure that he received a fair trial. even if he didn't know who she was. The second day of trial began with Prosecutor Robert Hayes calling Peter Kim to the witness stand. Angela watched carefully as the young store clerk walked to the front of the courtroom, his nervous energy evident in every step. Kim was 24 years old, a college student working nights to pay for his classes, and this was clearly his first time testifying in a criminal trial. Hayes led Kim through his testimony with practiced efficiency. The clerk described the events of that Tuesday night in detail, how a man in a dark hoodie had entered the store around 9:30, approached the counter and demanded money from the register. Kim said the man had kept one hand in his pocket, implying he had a weapon, though no gun was ever visible on the security footage. "I was scared," Kim testified, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just gave him the money and hoped he would leave without hurting me." When Hayes asked Kim to identify the robber, the young man pointed directly at David without hesitation. "That's him. I'm sure of it." But during cross-examination, Lisa Chen finally showed some of the skill that had gotten her through law school. She questioned Kim about the lighting in the store, the angle of the security cameras, and the stress he must have been feeling during the robbery. Slowly, cracks began to appear in his confident identification. "You told police initially that you couldn't see the robber's face clearly, didn't you?" Chen asked. Kim shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Yes, but I thought about it more later and I remembered more details. Memory doesn't usually become clearer over time, especially in traumatic situations, does it?" Hayes objected, claiming the question called for expert testimony, but Angela overruled him. She wanted to hear Kim's answer. "I don't know," Kim admitted. "I just know that when I saw his picture, I recognized him." Angela found herself paying closer attention to the details of Kim's testimony than she might have in another case. She noticed that the young man kept touching a small bandage on his left hand, and when Chen asked about it, Kim explained that he had cut himself on broken glass while cleaning up after the robbery. "What glass?" Chen asked. "There's no mention of broken glass in the police report." Kim looked confused. "There was a bottle of soda that fell off the counter during the robbery. It broke on the floor," Angela made a note. "If there had been broken glass at the scene, it should have been photographed and documented as part of the crime scene investigation." The fact that it wasn't mentioned in any reports suggested that the police investigation had been less thorough than it should have been. The next witness was Officer Martinez, one of the two policemen who had arrested David. His testimony followed the standard pattern. He described finding David 6 blocks from the store, his apparent intoxication, and his inability to provide a clear explanation of his whereabouts that evening. But again, Lisa Chen's cross-examination revealed important details that the prosecution had glossed over. Officer Martinez admitted that David had been cooperative and nonviolent during the arrest. He hadn't tried to run or resist in any way. When asked about his whereabouts, David had seemed genuinely confused rather than evasive. "Did Mr. Coleman appear to be trying to deceive you?" Chen asked. Martinez considered the question carefully. "No, he seemed more confused than anything else. Like he honestly didn't know where he was or how he got there." Angela was impressed by Chen's improved performance, but she could see that the young lawyer was still missing crucial opportunities. When Martinez mentioned that David had been carrying a small backpack when arrested, Chen failed to ask what was in it or whether it had been searched. When the officer described David's appearance as disheveled and agitated, Chen didn't explore what that might indicate about his mental state or his activities that evening. During the lunch recess, Angela called both attorneys to her chambers for a conference. It was an unusual move, but she wanted to address some procedural issues that could affect the fairness of the trial. "Ms. Chen," she began, "I notice that you haven't filed any motions regarding the admissibility of the identification evidence. Are you satisfied that proper procedures were followed during the lineup?" Chen looked surprised by the question. I haven't had time to fully investigate that issue, Your Honor." Angela turned to Hayes. "Mr. Hayes, I'd like to see the complete file on the photo lineup identification, including any notes from the investigating officers about the procedure used." Hayes nodded. But Angela could see the concern in his expression. She was asking for a level of documentation that many prosecutors took for granted would never be scrutinized so carefully. "I'm also concerned about the completeness of the crime scene investigation," Angela continued. The witness mentioned broken glass that doesn't appear in any of the police reports. I want a full inventory of what was collected from the scene and what forensic analysis was performed. Both lawyers left her chambers with additional work to do, but Angela felt she had managed to raise these issues without appearing biased toward either side. She was simply ensuring that all evidence was properly documented and that both parties had access to complete information. The afternoon session brought a surprise that changed everything. Hayes called Detective Thompson, the lead investigator on the case, to testify about the evidence collected from the scene. But when Chen cross-examined him about the broken glass that Kim had mentioned, Thompson's testimony revealed a significant oversight. "We didn't specifically document broken glass at the scene," Thompson admitted, "but we did notice that one of the security cameras had a better angle than we initially realized." Chen looked confused. "A better angle of what?" "Of the parking lot behind the store. We reviewed that footage later and found something interesting." Angela felt her pulse quicken. This was new information that apparently hadn't been shared with the defense. "What did you find?" Chen asked. Hayes stood to object, claiming the question was beyond the scope of direct examination, but Angela overruled him. "I want to hear this testimony, counselor," Thompson continued reluctantly. "The parking lot camera picked up a figure running behind the store at approximately 9:35 p.m., about 3 minutes after the robbery. The person was wearing dark clothing similar to what the robber had on." "Did you follow up on this evidence?" Chen asked. "We tried to, but the image quality wasn't good enough to make an identification. We assumed it was probably the same person from the store footage." Angela leaned forward. "Detective Thompson, did you check to see if there were any other security cameras in the area that might have captured this person's route?" Thompson looked uncomfortable. "We did a basic canvass of the immediate area, but we didn't find any additional cameras." Angela wasn't satisfied. "What about traffic cameras? Business security systems on adjacent streets? Did you check with the city traffic department or contact other businesses that might have had surveillance systems?" "No, Your Honor. We felt we had sufficient evidence to make the arrest." Angela could feel her frustration building. This was exactly the kind of sloppy police work that led to wrongful convictions. But she also realized that her personal investment in David's case might be making her more critical than usual of the investigation. "Ms. Chen," she said, "I'm going to grant you additional time to investigate these surveillance issues. This trial will recess until Monday to allow both sides to conduct a more thorough review of available evidence." Hayes looked shocked. "Your Honor, we've already presented our case." "There's no need for additional delay." Angela's voice was firm. "Mr. Hayes, if there's additional evidence that might be relevant to this case, we need to examine it thoroughly. Justice delayed is better than justice denied." As the courtroom emptied, Angela remained at the bench feeling both satisfied and troubled by her decision. She had given David's defense a chance to investigate leads that might exonerate him, but she had also opened herself up to criticism for showing unusual interest in a routine criminal case. That evening, Angela received a call from Judge Morrison, her colleague who handled similar cases. "Angela, I heard you recessed the Coleman trial for additional investigation. Is everything all right?" "That's not like you." Angela chose her words carefully. "I just want to make sure we have all the relevant evidence before proceeding. There seem to be some gaps in the investigation." "Well, be careful," Morrison warned. "Defense attorneys will start expecting special treatment if word gets around that you're willing to halt trials for their fishing expeditions." After hanging up, Angela realized that her decisions were already being noticed and questioned by her colleagues. She was walking a fine line between ensuring fairness and appearing to show favoritism, but as she thought about David sitting in his jail cell, probably with no idea that someone who once cared about him was fighting for his right to a fair trial, she knew she had made the right choice. The truth was starting to emerge piece by piece. Angela just hoped that when all the evidence was finally examined, it would point toward justice rather than toward the comfortable assumptions that had nearly convicted an innocent man. Monday morning arrived with an electricity in the courtroom that Angela had rarely experienced in her 12 years on the bench. Word had spread through the legal community about the unusual recess she had granted, and the gallery was fuller than usual with attorneys and court observers curious to see what new evidence might emerge. Lisa Chen looked different as she entered the courtroom. Gone was the overwhelmed, scattered young lawyer from the previous week. In her place was someone who had clearly spent the weekend working harder than she ever had before. She carried herself with new confidence, her files organized and her approach focused in a way that reminded Angela of her own early days as an attorney. David also looked different. He was still wearing the same orange jumpsuit, still had the same tired eyes and graying hair, but something in his posture suggested that he was paying attention to the proceedings for the first time since the trial began. Angela wondered if Chen had finally been able to explain to him what was happening and why the additional investigation might matter. Hayes, on the other hand, looked like a man who had spent the weekend worrying. He kept glancing toward the back of the courtroom where his supervisor from the district attorney's office sat watching. Angela knew that prosecutors didn't like surprises, especially in cases they had considered routine convictions. "Your Honor," Chen began, standing with an authority she hadn't shown before, "the defense has uncovered significant new evidence that casts serious doubt on the prosecution's case against Mr. Coleman." Angela nodded for her to continue, though her heart was racing. Whatever Chen had found, it was about to change everything. During our investigation of the surveillance footage from surrounding businesses, we discovered that the Lincoln Street Market has been experiencing a series of robberies over the past 6 months, all following a similar pattern. More importantly, we found traffic camera footage from the intersection of Lincoln and Oak that shows the actual perpetrator fleeing the scene. Chen approached the bench with a laptop computer. "Your Honor, this footage clearly shows a person running east on Lincoln Street at 9:34 p.m., approximately 2 minutes after the robbery. The individual is wearing dark clothing consistent with the store footage, but the traffic camera captures his face as he passes under the streetlight." Angela leaned forward to examine the laptop screen. The image was grainy but clear enough to see that the person in the footage was significantly shorter than David, with different facial features and a completely different body type. There was no way this could be the same person who was sitting at the defendant's table. Furthermore, Chen continued, "we were able to track this individual's route using additional traffic cameras. He fled to a bus stop 6 blocks away, where transit authority cameras captured clear images of his face as he boarded the 9:45 bus heading downtown." Hayes stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this is all speculation. There's no proof that this person has anything to do with the robbery at the corner market." Chen was ready for the objection. "Actually, Mr. Hayes, there is. The transit authority was able to identify the individual from their surveillance footage. His name is Kevin Murphy, and he was arrested 2 days ago for robbing a convenience store downtown using exactly the same methods described in this case." A murmur went through the courtroom. Angela felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to maintain judicial composure. "Ms. Chen, do you have documentation of this arrest?" "Yes, Your Honor." Chen handed a stack of papers to the bailiff. "Mr. Murphy confessed to multiple robberies when he was arrested, including the incident at Corner Market on the night in question. He specifically mentioned taking approximately $300 from that store." Angela reviewed the documents carefully. Kevin Murphy's confession was detailed and specific, including information about the store's layout and the clerk's behavior that could only have come from someone who was actually there. The confession also explained why Peter Kim's identification had been wrong. Murphy and David shared some general physical characteristics when seen from a distance, but up close they looked nothing alike. Hayes was frantically reviewing his own files, clearly caught off guard by these developments. "Your Honor, we were not informed of Murphy's arrest or his confession. We need time to verify this information." Angela looked at the prosecutor with a mixture of disappointment and understanding. The system had failed here, not necessarily because of malicious intent, but because of the kind of rushed, incomplete investigation that happened all too often when everyone assumed guilt from the beginning. "Mr. Hayes, are you withdrawing the charges against Mr. Coleman?" Hayes looked toward the back of the courtroom where his supervisor was shaking his head vigorously. "Your Honor, we request time to investigate these new claims." Angela felt her patience wearing thin. An innocent man had been sitting in jail for 3 weeks while the real perpetrator continued committing crimes. The evidence of David's innocence was overwhelming, and any further delay would be unconscionable. "Mr. Hayes, based on the evidence presented today, I'm dismissing all charges against Mr. Coleman. The defendant is free to go." The courtroom erupted in surprised conversations. Angela watched as David turned to look at Chen with an expression of confusion and growing hope. It was clear that he hadn't fully understood what was happening until this moment, but Angela wasn't finished. As the courtroom began to settle down, she made an announcement that surprised everyone, including herself. Before we adjourn, I want to address something that has been weighing on my mind throughout this trial. Mr. Coleman and I knew each other many years ago, when we were both law students. I want to be completely transparent about this connection and my reasons for handling this case as I did. The silence in the courtroom was complete. Hayes looked shocked, Chen looked confused, and David looked up at her for the first time with what might have been recognition flickering in his eyes. When I first saw Mr. Coleman in my courtroom, I faced a difficult ethical decision. I could have recused myself immediately, which would have been the safe choice. Instead, I chose to stay on the case because I believed that my experience and attention to detail might help ensure that he received a fair trial. Angela paused, knowing that her next words would be scrutinized by ethics boards and legal commentators for years to come. I want to be clear that my personal knowledge of Mr. Coleman's character did not influence my legal decisions. What influenced me was my commitment to ensuring that every defendant receives competent representation and thorough investigation of the evidence. The fact that this case involved someone I once knew simply made me more aware of how easily the system can fail when we take shortcuts or make assumptions. She looked directly at David as she continued. Mr. Coleman, you have been through a terrible ordeal, but I hope you can find some comfort in knowing that the truth has finally emerged. You are innocent of these charges, and I sincerely hope that you can use this experience as a foundation for rebuilding your life. David stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Angela's face. For a moment she thought he might say something, might acknowledge their shared past or express gratitude for her careful handling of his case. Instead, he simply nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both recognition and respect. As David was released from custody and the courtroom emptied, Angela remained at the bench, knowing that the hardest part was yet to come. Within hours, news of her disclosure would spread throughout the legal community. Some would praise her for her transparency and thorough handling of the case. Others would question her judgment in not recusing herself immediately. A week later, Angela received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with David's handwriting, the same careful script she remembered from their law school notes. Angela, it read, I don't know if you remember me, but I remember you. Thank you for seeing me as a person rather than just another case. I know you took a risk by staying on my case, and I know you did it because you still believe in justice, not because of who I used to be. I'm getting help now, and for the first time in years, I have hope. You gave me back my life, but more than that, you reminded me that there are still people in the system who care about getting it right. I'm going to try to be worthy of that second chance. Angela kept the letter in her desk drawer, reading it whenever she felt discouraged by the endless stream of cases and the imperfections of the justice system. David's case had taught her that sometimes doing the right thing meant taking risks, asking hard questions and refusing to accept easy answers. 6 months later, she learned that David had entered a rehabilitation program and was working as a paralegal for a nonprofit organization that helped homeless individuals navigate the legal system. He would never practice law again, but he was using his knowledge and experience to help people who faced the same struggles he had endured. Angela never saw David again after that day in court, but his case changed how she approached every trial that followed. She became known as a judge who paid attention to details, who asked tough questions, and who never forgot that behind every case file was a human being whose life hung in the balance. The Legal Ethics Board ultimately concluded that Angela had acted appropriately, noting that her transparency and careful handling of the case had actually strengthened, rather than weakened, the judicial process. But more importantly, Angela knew that she had kept faith with the ideals that had drawn her to the law in the first place, the belief that justice was worth fighting for, even when that fight required personal courage and professional risk. In the end, David Coleman's case became a reminder that the justice system worked best when everyone involved, judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys, took their responsibilities seriously and refused to take shortcuts in the pursuit of truth. It was a lesson that Angela carried with her for the rest of her career, and one that made her a better judge and a better person.